The roar of the crowd fades into a dull, rhythmic hum, the kind you hear when the air is thick with tension and the stakes are higher than the city skyline. Beneath the blinding arena lights, a single figure stands at the free throw line, the game clock bleeding seconds, the weight of a franchise, a city, and a legacy pressing down on his shoulders like a collapsing star. But this isn't just a story about a championship ring or a buzzer beater. It's about the quiet before the storm, the secrets whispered in locker room shadows, and the unseen price of greatness that no contract can ever cover. The ball feels heavier tonight, not because of the pressure, but because of a message received just hours before, a message that turned his entire world sideways and made this game, this single moment, about so much more than just basketball. You can see it in his eyes, a flicker of something raw and unscripted, a story he's desperately trying to keep buried beneath the sweat and the swagger. But the truth has a way of bleeding through the floorboards of fame. The journey to this precipice began not in the gleaming arenas of the NBA, but on the cracked concrete courts of a small Texas town, where the only lights were the flickering street lamps, and the only audience was the occasional passing car. This is where the young man learned the game, not just as a sport, but as a language of survival, a way to translate the chaos of a broken home into the elegant geometry of a bounce pass and a fadeaway jumper. He was a ghost in the high school gym, arriving before the janitors and leaving after the last custodian locked up, his only company the echo of his own dribble and the relentless whisper of his own ambition. Every scout who saw him play saw a natural talent, a fluidity of movement that couldn't be taught, but what they missed was the fire in his gut, a burning resentment that he channeled into every crossover and every pull-up three-pointer. College was supposed to be his ticket, his chance to finally silence the critics who said he was too raw, too reckless. But it was there that the real battle began, not against the opposing teams, but against the expectations of a coach who saw him as a weapon and the media who saw him as a headline waiting to happen. The draft night was a blur of flashbulbs and tailored suits, a surreal moment where his lifelong dream collided with the cold, hard business of professional basketball, and he was suddenly thrust into a world of million-dollar contracts and million-dollar pressures. He was no longer just a player. He was a product, a symbol of hope for a struggling franchise, a face on billboards, and a name that commentators debated with a ferocity that felt personal and invasive. The locker room was a new kind of battlefield, a mosaic of egos and ambitions where he had to prove not just his skill, but his loyalty and his toughness, navigating the unspoken rules of veteran leadership and the fragile alliances of a team on the verge of something great. Every victory was a temporary antidote to the gnawing anxiety that came with the spotlight, and every loss was a dagger, a public failure that was dissected on sports shows and social media feeds, turning his private struggles into public entertainment. The pressure was a constant companion, a voice in his ear that grew louder with every passing game. And it was in the midst of this relentless storm that he found a quiet harbor, a confidant who saw past the fame and the fortune to the broken kid still trying to prove his worth. She was the one person who could calm the chaos, who could remind him of the boy who loved the game before it became a profession. But even that sanctuary was built on a foundation of secrets and unspoken fears, a fragile piece that was about to be shattered by a single, unexpected surprise that would make the roar of the crowd seem deafeningly silent and the weight of the ball in his hands feel heavier than it ever had before. The surprise wasn't a car or a diamond necklace, the kind of lavish gifts that usually made headlines and sparked envy among his peers. It was something far more dangerous, a relic from a past he had tried to bury so deep that even he had almost forgotten its existence. A package had arrived at his penthouse, wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address, and inside was a single item that turned his blood to ice. A worn, faded photograph of him as a teenager, standing next to a man whose face he had spent years trying to erase from his memory. The man was his former mentor, the one who had taught him the fundamentals of the game in those early days on the cracked concrete courts, but who had also been the catalyst for a scandal that nearly destroyed his family and sent his mother into a spiral of despair from which she never fully recovered. This mentor, a local legend turned con artist, had manipulated the young prodigy, using his talent as a front for a gambling ring that preyed on the desperate hopes of their small town. And when the truth came out, It was the teenager who bore the brunt of the shame, the one labeled a cheat and a liar, while the real mastermind slipped away into the shadows. He had spent his entire career running from that ghost, building a new identity brick by brick, until he became the unstoppable force the league now feared. But this photograph was a threat, a promise that the past was not as buried as he had believed. The note attached to the picture was cryptic, just a date and a time, and the name of a city where his team was scheduled to play in the upcoming playoffs. And suddenly, the championship run that had been his singular focus was clouded by a fog of paranoia and dread. He couldn't tell his teammates, couldn't risk the fragile chemistry they had built over the long season, and he certainly couldn't tell the coaching staff, who would see it as a distraction and a liability that could derail their entire season. He turned to the only person he trusted, his confidant, the quiet harbor in his storm, but he could see in her eyes that even she was shaken, that the story he had shared with her in hushed whispers late at night was now a real and present danger that could not be ignored or reasoned away. The pressure of the looming playoffs, the expectation to deliver a championship to a city starving for a title, was already crushing, but now it was intertwined with a mystery that threatened to expose his darkest secret, a secret that, if revealed, would not just ruin his career, but would shatter the legacy he had sacrificed everything to build. He spent the nights replaying old memories, trying to figure out who could have sent the package and what they wanted, his mind racing through a list of enemies he had made on his rise to the top, from disgruntled former agents to rival players he had humiliated on the court. The game, once his refuge and his salvation, now felt like a trap, a stage where his downfall could be broadcast to the world in high definition, and every dribble, every pass, every shot was accompanied by the chilling thought that someone in the stands was watching him, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As he stood on the practice court, the familiar squeak of his sneakers against the polished wood now sounded like a warning, a countdown to a collision between the man he had become and the boy he had tried so desperately to leave behind. The playoffs arrived like a freight train, unstoppable and terrifying, and with them came the weight of a city's hopes and the ghost of a past that refused to stay buried. He stepped onto the court for Game 1 of the first-round series, the arena vibrating with a deafening energy that usually fueled his fire. But tonight, every face in the crowd seemed like a potential threat, every flash of a camera a possible trap. The opposing team's star player, a brash young gun with a chip on his shoulder, was talking trash from the opening tip, trying to get inside his head, but the real battle was already being fought in the shadows of his own mind. He played on instinct, his body moving through the motions of the game while his soul was elsewhere, searching for answers in the faces of the fans, in the corners of the stadium, anywhere that might reveal the cinder of that ominous photograph. The first quarter was a blur, a series of missed shots and uncharacteristic turnovers that had the commentators questioning his composure and the home crowd growing restless, their cheers turning to murmurs of doubt. During a timeout, he sat on the bench, his head buried in a towel, trying to block out the noise and focus on the game plan. But all he could see was that faded photograph, the ghost of his mentor staring back at him with a knowing smile. His teammate, the veteran power forward who had seen it all, placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered something in his ear, a simple reminder of the journey they had taken together, the battles they had fought and won. And for a fleeting moment, the fog lifted and he saw the game clearly again. He exploded in the second half, a fury of crossovers and step-back jumpers that silenced the doubters and ignited the crowd, his performance a defiant statement that he would not be broken, not tonight, not by anyone. The final buzzer sounded, and the victory was his, a hard-fought win that should have been a moment of pure elation. But as he walked off the court, his eyes scanned the tunnel, searching for a familiar face that he hoped he would never see again. That was when he saw it, a flash of a familiar silhouette disappearing behind a curtain, a figure that moved with a gait he recognized all too well, a ghost from his past that had just confirmed his worst fears. His mentor was not just a memory, he was a threat, and he was here. The victory felt hollow, a temporary reprieve in a war that was only just beginning. And as he showered and dressed, the victory champagne in the locker room tasted like ashes in his mouth. He knew he couldn't run anymore. He had to confront this ghost, face the past he had tried so desperately to outrun, but he also knew that the timing couldn't be worse. with the stakes higher than ever and a championship hanging in the balance. He made a decision in that moment, a vow to himself and to the city that believed in him, that he would not let this shadow destroy everything he had built, that he would fight with every ounce of his being, not just for a title, but for his soul. The game was over, but the real battle was just beginning, a fight that would take him to the darkest corners of his past and force him to confront the question he had been avoiding for years. Was he the hero of his own story, or was he destined to be the villain? The next morning, the city was buzzing with headlines praising his heroic second-half performance. But he couldn't read a single word without feeling the cold knot of dread tightening in his chest. He had a decision to make, one that could unravel everything, and he knew the only way forward was to hunt down the ghost before the ghost hunted him. He started where all stories from his past began, the old neighborhood, the cracked concrete courts, the corner store that had been a refuge for a scared kid with a basketball and a dream. The streets hadn't changed much, still rough around the edges, still filled with the same desperate energy that had once fueled his ambition. But now it felt like a trap, a maze of memories that could swallow him whole. He found the old man who ran the store, a grizzled figure with kind eyes who had watched him grow from a scrawny kid to a college prospect. And he asked the question that had been burning in his mind. Had anyone been asking about him? Anyone from the old days? The old man hesitated, his gaze dropping to the counter. And that hesitation told him everything he needed to know. His mentor had been here, stirring up the past, planting seeds of chaos that were now beginning to bloom. The trail led him to a rundown motel on the edge of town, a place where faded neon lights flickered against a sky that seemed perpetually gray, and he stood outside the door, his hand trembling as he raised it to knock. The door swung open before his knuckles could make contact, and there he was, the man who had shaped his game and shattered his childhood, older now, with a face lined by years of hard living and a smile that was equal parts charm and malice. The mentor invited him in with a wave of his hand, as if they were old friends meeting for coffee, and the young star stepped inside, his heart pounding with a fury that was part fear and part rage. The room was cluttered with betting slips and newspaper clippings, a shrine to the career he had built, and the mentor spoke with a voice that was smooth and poisonous, weaving a tale of desperation and second chances. He claimed he had come back not to destroy, but to reclaim, to ask for a small favor, a piece of the fortune that he felt was rightfully his, a payoff for the secrets he could reveal to the world. The price was steep, a sum that would raise eyebrows and trigger investigations, but the alternative was worse, the exposure of a young man's complicity in a gambling ring, a story that the media would feast on for weeks. He stood there, looking at the man who had once been his hero, and he felt the weight of every choice he had ever made, the good and the bad, converging in this dingy motel room. He knew he couldn't pay, not just because of the money, but because it would be an admission of guilt, a surrender to the shadows of his past, and he had fought too hard and come too far to let that happen. The confrontation was inevitable, a collision of two worlds that had been orbiting each other for years. And as the mentor leaned back in his chair, his eyes glinting with the confidence of a man who held all the cards, the young star realized that this was not just a negotiation, it was a test of everything he believed about himself, a moment that would define his legacy long after the final buzzer. The words hung in the stale air of the motel room, heavy and suffocating, as the mentor laid out his ultimatum with a chilling calmness that betrayed years of practice in the art of manipulation. He wanted $100,000, cash, delivered to a locker at the city's bus station by the end of the week, and in return, he would disappear back into the shadows, taking the photograph and the secrets it represented with him. The young star felt his stomach lurch, not just at the audacity of the demand, but at the sickening realization that this man had been watching him all along, tracking his every move, calculating the exact moment to strike for maximum impact. He thought about the championship run, the teammates who had bled beside him, the city that had embraced him as its own, and he knew that paying the ransom would be an act of betrayal, a surrender that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He looked into the mentor's eyes, searching for a shred of the man he had once admired, but all he saw was a predator, a creature of greed and resentment who saw him not as a former protege, but as a bank account with legs. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface for years finally boiled over, and he spoke with a voice that was low and trembling with a fury he could no longer contain, telling the mentor that he would never see a single dollar, that he would rather burn his career to the ground than let this ghost control him any longer. The mentor laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed off the cheap wallpaper, and warned him that the media would have a field day with the story, that his reputation would be tarnished beyond repair, and that the league would likely suspend him indefinitely while they investigated the allegations. He stood his ground, his fists clenched at his sides, and told the mentor to do his worst, that he had already survived the worst that life could throw at him, and that he would not be broken by a man who had spent his entire life preying on the dreams of others. The confrontation reached a fever pitch, the two men locked in a battle of wills that felt more intense than any game he had ever played, and for a moment, he saw a flicker of doubt in the mentor's eyes, a crack in the armor of confidence that had been his greatest weapon. He turned and walked out of the motel room, his heart racing, his mind spinning with the consequences of his defiance. But there was also a strange sense of liberation, a feeling that he had finally taken a stand against the darkness that had followed him for so long. He knew the mentor would not go quietly, that a war was now inevitable, but he also knew that he had crossed a line, that he had chosen integrity over fear, and that whatever came next, he would face it with his head held high and his conscience clear. The drive back to the team hotel was a blur, the city lights smearing into streaks of color as he replayed the conversation in his mind, searching for any angle he had missed, any leverage he could use to turn the tables on his tormentor. He arrived at the hotel just as the sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed almost mocking in their beauty, and he knew that he had only hours to prepare for Game 2 of the series, a game that would be played under the weight of a ticking clock. He stepped into the elevator, exhausted but resolute, and as the doors closed, he made a silent vow to himself that he would not let this man destroy him, that he would find a way to expose the truth, to clear his name, and to reclaim the narrative of his life, no matter what it cost him. The hours before Game 2 passed like days, each minute stretching into an eternity as he sat alone in his hotel room, staring at the ceiling and replaying every word of the confrontation in his mind. His phone buzzed relentlessly with messages from teammates and coaches, checking in on his mental state, but he couldn't bring himself to respond, couldn't find the words to explain the war raging inside his head. He knew he had to tell someone, to unburden himself before the weight crushed him entirely, and the only person he could trust was the quiet harbor, the woman who had seen him at his lowest and loved him anyway. He called her, his voice cracking as he recounted the meeting, the ultimatum, the cold laughter that still echoed in his ears, and she listened without judgment, her silence a soothing balm on his wounded spirit. She told him to focus on the game, to channel his rage into his performance, and to leave the detective work to her, a promise that both relieved and terrified him, because he knew she was just as vulnerable as he was. The arena that night was a cauldron of noise and expectation, the fans hungry for another victory, the commentators dissecting his every move, and the opposing team desperate to even the series. He walked onto the court with a fire in his eyes that was different from the usual competitive flame, a raw, primal energy that came from a place of desperation and defiance. The first quarter was a statement, a barrage of three-pointers and acrobatic drives that left the defense scrambling and the crowd on their feet, his performance a middle finger to the ghost lurking in the shadows. But the mentor was there, he knew it, felt it in the pit of his stomach, a presence in the rafters that was watching his every move, waiting for him to falter. The game became a chess match, his brilliance on the court matched by the psychological warfare off it, and he could feel the mentor's influence in every missed free throw, every turnover, every moment of hesitation. At halftime, the score was tied, and he sat in the locker room, his head in his hands, the weight of the world pressing down on him as his teammates rallied around him, their words of encouragement a distant hum in the background. He looked up at the veteran power forward, the man who had become a brother to him, and he saw something in his eyes, a knowing glint that suggested he understood more than he was letting on. The veteran leaned in, his voice low and urgent, and told him that he had seen the mentor lurking around the hotel, that he had done some digging and discovered a pattern of extortion that stretched back years, a trail of broken careers and shattered dreams that this man had left in his wake. The revelation hit him like a thunderbolt, a surge of adrenaline that replaced his fear with a fierce determination to end this once and for all. He walked back onto the court for the second half, not as a victim, but as a hunter, his eyes scanning the crowd with a new clarity, knowing that the only way to win this war was to expose the mentor publicly, to shine a light so bright that the shadows could no longer hide. He played with a fury that was almost reckless, his body a weapon, his spirit unbreakable, and with every basket, he was not just scoring points, he was reclaiming his narrative, one possession at a time. The final buzzer sounded, a victory secured, but as the crowd roared and his teammates celebrated, he was already formulating a plan, a gambit that would either save his career or destroy it completely. The victory was sweet, but the celebration in the locker room felt hollow, a mask he wore to hide the storm brewing beneath the surface. And as soon as the last reporter left, he pulled the veteran aside and told him everything. The full story of the gambling ring, the manipulation, and the mentor's relentless grip on his past. The veteran listened without interruption, his face a mask of stone, and when the young star finished, he let out a long, low whistle, a sound that carried the weight of years of experience and hard-won wisdom. He told the young star that he had a contact in the league office, a security official who specialized in background checks and integrity investigations, and that this official had been tracking the mentor for years, building a case that had never quite found its smoking gun. The plan was simple but dangerous. They would set a trap, use the money as bait, and record the mentor accepting the payoff, a confession that would not only clear the young star's name, but would put the ghost behind bars for good. He hesitated, the fear of exposure and the risk of failure gnawing at him. But the veteran's steady gaze gave him the courage he needed, and he agreed to the plan with a trembling voice that betrayed his uncertainty. The next day, they orchestrated the operation with military precision, the veteran coordinating with his league contact while the young star prepared the cash, his hands shaking as he counted the bills that felt more like a down payment on his soul. He drove to the bus station, the same one where the mentor had demanded the drop-off, and he placed the bag in the designated locker, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure the entire city could hear it. He walked away, his steps measured and deliberate, and he took his position in a surveillance van parked across the street, the veteran and the league official beside him, their eyes fixed on the locker. The hours crawled by, the tension in the van thick enough to cut with a knife, and he began to wonder if the mentor had sensed the trap, if he had slipped away into the night, leaving the young star to drown in his own paranoia. But then, just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot, a figure emerged from the darkness, moving with that familiar, predatory gait that had haunted his nightmares for years. The mentor approached the locker, his eyes darting left and right, his movements quick and furtive, and as he opened the locker and reached for the bag, the league official gave the signal, and the van's doors flew open. The mentor froze, his face a mask of shock and fury, and in that moment, the young star stepped out of the van, his heart racing, his eyes locked on the man who had stolen so much from him. The confrontation was brief and brutal, the mentor spitting curses and threats as the authorities closed in, his carefully constructed facade crumbling like sand in a storm. The young star watched as the man who had once been his hero was led away in handcuffs, the photograph and the secrets it represented now meaningless, rendered powerless by the truth that had finally come to light. He stood there in the empty parking lot, the night air cool against his skin, and he felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a burden he had carried for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely. The victory was not just on the court anymore. It was a victory over his past, a triumph of courage over fear, and as he walked back to his car, he knew that the game would continue, that the playoffs were far from over, but for the first time in his life, he was playing without the chains of his history dragging him down. He drove back to the hotel, the city lights blurring past him, and he allowed himself a small, tentative smile, a glimpse of the man he was meant to be, unburdened and unbroken.